gives me particular pleasure to introduce Benjamin Levy, today's speaker, a new member of the Chinese studies community at Michigan. He is still waiting to defend his dissertation at Harvard University in May, and he has started just this fall to teach, I guess, East Asian and world history at the University of Michigan at Dearborn. So he has been trained at Harvard in Manchu studies, Inner Asian and Qing history, and before that was trained at the important Center of Central Asian and East Asian Studies at Indiana University. His interest, as I said, concerns Qing and Inner Asian history, Manchuristics, and the comparative study of borderlands, and today's talk is very much in that vein. It's entitled, as you can see on the screen, In the Land of the People Without Sutras, Jungar Refugees and Qing-Kazakh Relations, 1758 through 1775. Please join me in welcoming Professor Levy.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Center for Chinese Studies for hosting this talk today. This is a great opportunity to present my research to the Chinese studies community here. I just moved to Michigan just 3 months ago. I'm really liking it here so far, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know you all in the months and years that come. So my talk today will focus on this region here, circled in red. This includes parts of Xinjiang province in the People's Republic of China, but also parts of the independent nations of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Now, until 1745, this region was ruled over by a confederation of Oirat Mongols known as the Jungar Empire. In 1745, the Jungar leader, Galdan Charing, perished. Galdan Charing's death set in motion a violent struggle between Jungar aristocrats for control of the empire. As Jungaria fell into civil war, the Jungar's two historical enemies, the Kazakh Confederation in the west and the Qing Empire in the east, rushed to fill in the power vacuum. The Kazakhs raided the Jungar lands repeatedly from 1748 to 1756, occupying the western pastures of the former Jungar state and enslaving thousands of Jungar refugees in the process. Now, in 1754, the Qing Emperor Qianlong sent an army into Jungaria and occupied the Jungar's eastern pastures with a small garrison force. After an Oirat rebellion against Qing rule in 1755, the Qing retaliated with overwhelming force. Qianlong ordered his military commanders to undertake a sanguinary campaign of violence against the shattered remnants of the Jungar Confederation, killing tens of thousands of Oirat refugees, including women and children. These massacres, which several scholars have argued are tantamount to ethnic genocide, continued against the Jungars until the Qing declared a final victory in 1759. Now, at the outset, I should say that the word Oirat is the ethnonym. This refers to the Jungar people. Jungar is the name of the state, but I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably in my talk today. So when I say Jungar and Oirat, I mean the same thing. Now, viewed from the perspective of Qing history, the year 1759 marked the culmination of a century of wars between the Jungars and three successive Qing emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. Indeed, one could argue that the final destruction of the Jungar Empire in 1759 represented an epochal change in almost 2 millennia of relations between the sedentary civilization of China proper and the nomadic steppe peoples of the Northwest. The military power of the Inner Asian nomads who had threatened China's northwest frontier since at least the Han Dynasty, the Xiongnu, the Turks, the Mongols, had been permanently destroyed. Qianlong had succeeded where his predecessors had failed by providing his realm with a secure border on the northwest frontier. Never again would nomads threaten the security of the Qing Empire. In my talk today, however, I will argue that this Qing-centered perspective overlooks the broader Eurasian historical context of the fall of the Jungars. So when we view the final collapse of the Jungars in 1759, not from the perspective of Qing history, but from the perspective of Eurasian history, 1759 takes on a different significance. Since the late 17th century, the Jungars had also fought a nearly century-long series of wars with their enemy in the west, the Kazakhs. In a particularly devastating series of raids in the 1720s, the Jungars occupied a large swath of the heartland of the Kazakh pastures. The Kazakhs regrouped and eventually pushed the Jungars back from the Kazakh lands. But warfare and raiding continued between the Kazakhs and Jungars throughout the mid-18th century. When the Jungar Confederation imploded following the Jungar Civil War in the 1740s, the Kazakhs raided the Jungar lands repeatedly, not only taking captives, but also colonizing the Jungars' former territory. The Kazakhs' colonization of the Jungar lands was the final outcome of a century-long series of wars that only ended when the Jungar state began to disintegrate in the late 1740s. So just to summarize, the Jungars had two enemies, right? They had the Kazakh Confederation in the west and the Qing Empire in the east. Now, it's certainly well known that the Jungars' wars with the Qing are, of course, quite famous. Everyone knows of the epic struggle between Kangxi and the Jungar leader Galden, and the wars that were fought under Yongzheng and then Qianlong's final suppression of the so-called Jungar menace in 1759. What's less well understood, though, is during the same time period, the Jungars were also fighting wars with their rival in the west, in Central Eurasia, the Kazakh Confederation, from 1680 to 1750. And my argument today is that to understand Qing rule in the Jungar lands, we have to understand it within the broader context of a century-long series of violence between the Kazakhs and the Jungars. In short, 1759, from the perspective of Qing history, is a major turning point. But when we view it from the perspective of Central Eurasian history, there's actually a lot of continuities based on a century of warfare and raiding between the Kazakhs and Jungars, and that those historical dynamics continue to be important after 1759. Now, although almost completely overlooked in Japanese, Chinese, and English language scholarship, Russian scholars have analyzed the Jungar-Kazakh wars in great detail, using both 18th century Russian language archival documents and Kazakh folktales recorded years later by Russian ethnographers. None of this Russian language scholarship, however, links this long history of Oirat Kazakh violence to the Kazakh slave raids during the Jungar Civil War. Now, my talk today will provide a counter-narrative to Qing-centered histories by placing the disintegration of the Jungar Confederation into the broader Eurasian context of a century of Oirat Kazakh violence. Now, in calling for a Eurasian-centered, as opposed to Qing-centered history of the Kazakh borderlands, I'm trying to break down the artificial divides that exist between scholars of Russian and Chinese history when studying the history of Central Eurasia. Scholars of Chinese and Russian history have anachronistically taken 20th century political divisions between the former Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China as their geographic unit of analysis when studying the pre-modern history of the borderlands. My research on the Jungars bridges this artificial divide between Chinese and Russian scholarly traditions by studying the borderlands as a coherent cultural and geographic unit. Now, before we move on to the body of the talk, I thought I'd say a little bit about the sources that my research is based on. I come to very different conclusions than others who have studied the borderlands, and that's because my work is based on a very different source base. This is a picture of a file copy of a Manchu palace memorial. I'm sure those of you who study Qing history, of course, are familiar with memorials. Palace memorials were either written in Chinese or in Manchu. They were, unlike Tiban or routine memorials, they were never bilingual. And as it happens, almost all of the sources for studying 18th century Qing Northwest are in Manchu. And these have been stored as file copies. They were stored in the Grand Council's record office in the First Historical Archives. And they're available for scholars today. They're well cataloged. And based on over 1,000 of these documents, I've come to some very different conclusions about the nature of Qing rule in the borderlands in the 18th century. This is where the archive of the Manchu documents are stored. This is the First Historical Archives in Beijing on the west side of the Forbidden City. This is the official basketball hoop of the First Historical Archives as well. Now, so keeping in mind, moving towards a more Eurasian centered history of the borderlands, I'm going to discuss two different case studies. The first, I'm going to answer the question, how did the Qing Empire and the Kazakh Confederation, the Jungar's two historical enemies, divide up the Jungar's former pastures between them. Okay? The second question, related to the first, is what role did bilingual Jungar refugees with hybrid identities, Jungar refugees who were captured by the Kazakhs in raids, what role did they play in facilitating Qing-Kazakh relations? During a century of war between the Kazakhs and the Jungars, many Oirats were captured by the Kazakhs, many Kazakhs were captured by the Oirats, and grew up bilingual. They grew up in both cultures, speaking both languages. And they became really important in facilitating Qing rule during the first, in the 15 to 20 years following the disintegration of the Jungar state. So let's begin with the first question. As I mentioned in my introduction, there was a long history of violence between the Kazakhs and the Jungars. At the same time that the Jungars were fighting the Qing, they were also fighting the Kazakh Confederation. Now this map details the raids that the Jungars launched into the Kazakh lands. Now these here were launched in the 1720s. According to Kazakh folk tradition, these raids occurred in 1723 in what is known in Kazakh folklore as the Oktaban Shuburinda, or the barefoot flight, when the Jungars launched a massive invasion into the Kazakh lands, killing many Kazakhs. There was loss of life. Eventually, under the leadership of Ablai, the Kazakhs pushed the Jungars back from their lands. But this didn't end these cycles of violence that were going on between the Jungars and Kazakhs in the 18th century. In the 1740s, right before the Jungar leader Galdan Charing launched another series of raids into the northern part of the Kazakh steppe. And these raids increased in intensity as the Jungar state imploded in 1745, and many Jungars, particularly women, were taken captive by the Kazakhs during this time. This is long before the Qing actually invaded Jungaria. Now, as you can see, I'll draw your attention to this map here. After 1758, when the Jungar state finally imploded, the reach of the Kazakh state expanded to include Semeretia, including the Lake Balkhash and the rivers that drain into it. The black line here represents the furthest limit of Qing expansion. So if you look again here, so the red circle expands here into Semeretia. So basically you have the Qing Empire and the Kazakhs both dividing the Jungar's former pastures between them. Now, previous scholars, when talking about the colonization of the Jungar lands, at least from the Qing perspective, they talk about the movement of Chinese settlers, of Qing imperial troops, of convicts banished to the frontier. There is a very detailed literature in this in Chinese. I'm arguing that there were two vectors to this colonial process, not one. At the same time that Qing settlers marched west, the Kazakhs also galloped east and also colonized the former lands of the Jungars. Now, the Qing didn't really agree with the Kazakhs occupying the former Jungar lands. The Qing court laid nominal claim to all of the former lands of the Jungars, even though they did not exercise state power in most of these lands. Now, while the Kazakhs exercised de facto control of the western Jungar pastures, and they didn't recognize Qing claims to these lands. As the Qing and the Kazakhs divided the Jungar pastures between them, their competing claims clashed along a line between Tarbagatai and the Lake Jaisang Basin. Right? So just to summarize, you have the Kazakhs on the west occupying the western parts of the Jungar pastures, the Qing occupying the eastern sections, and their competing claims clashed along a line right here. And in this corner right here is the city of Tarbagatai, the modern city of Tachang. And here, this is the Lake Jaisang Basin. This is the Erchis River, flows north from Lake Jaisang. And the Erchis, or the Irtush in Russian, was the furthest extent of Russian advance into Central Eurasia during the 1750s. This is another map. This is a map from a Chinese gazetteers that embodies the hopes of the most ardent Chinese irredentists who want to lay claim to all of Semeretia, including Lake Balkhash, as having been part of the the Qing Empire. As we will see, though, the Qing only laid nominal claim to these regions and didn't actually control them. These were occupied by the Kazakhs. Now, going forward, I'm going to trace the conflict that was engendered between the Kazakhs and the Qing over their competing claims to the Jungar lands. In 1759, two Kazakhs, named Khutubai and Atalay, presented a letter to the Qing counselor in Ili, requesting permission to nomadize in the former Jungar pastures in and around Tarbagatai, to the north and west of Ili. The text of the letter was as follows, and it's written on the screen here. The Jungar lands are all vacant, and we Kazakhs are nomadizing in the lands of Tarbagatai. We are all people who have submitted to the emperor, that is Qianlong, and become his subject. Will the Lord not bestow his grace and allow us to nomadize as far as Ili? Now, in essence, this was a polite request to what was already a fait accompli, namely that the Kazakhs were retroactively asking for permission to nomadize in lands that they had already occupied. The Qing court's response to Khutubai and Atalay's letter, which rejected their petition, reflected the Qing's nominal claim to all of the Oirat lands. The Jungar lands are lands that we have taken for ourselves. It is absolutely inappropriate to grant this land to the Kazakhs and allow them to nomadize there. Previously, when the Kazakh Sultan Ablai asked to allow us to nomadize in the lands of Tarbagatai, I handed down an edict and stated to him the reasons why this was inappropriate. Now, in looking at the request of Khutubai and Atalay, I see that the Kazakhs are gradually advancing forward and nomadizing in Tarbagatai. To not expel them from these lands is absolutely unacceptable. Now, this imperial edict recognized that the Kazakhs were gradually moving eastwards across the Jungar lands and encroaching upon Tarbagatai. As a former Jungar pastor, the Qing also laid claim to Tarbagatai, but in 1759, when Khutubai and Atalay submitted their petition, it did not yet exercise direct administrative control over the region. Tarbagatai was an empty frontier, claimed by both the Kazakhs and the Qing, but occupied and controlled by neither. Now, of course, the Kazakhs didn't agree with the Qing's nominal claim to all of the Jungar lands, since they were occupying many of these excellent pastures, and frequently, from the Qing perspective, trespassed in lands that the Qing claimed. Now the question arises, why did the Qing not more forcefully try to expel the Kazakhs from Qing territory? There's a long litany of court letters coming from the Qing court, where the Qianlong angrily demands that his officials expel the Kazakhs from Qing-claimed lands in the borderlands. But the Qing wasn't able to project its power that far into the steppe and wasn't able to expel the Kazakhs from Semerechia. And one of the reasons is the Qing could not afford to anger the Kazakhs because the Qing was dependent upon the Kazakh horse trade. Horses were one commodity that the Qing couldn't produce well themselves, but that were absolutely vital to their control in Central Eurasia. So in exchange for silks, the Qing bought large numbers of horses, but they really couldn't afford to piss the Kazakhs off too much, because if they did, then they would be cut off from their supply of horses. So every time the Kazakhs would trespass, the Qing would scold them, maybe confiscate some of their livestock, flog one or two Kazakhs, but then kind of let them off the hook and say, just this once we'll expel you from our lands, but don't do it again. Now there were several reasons why the Qing wasn't able to expel the Kazakhs from lands that they claimed. One is the logistical problems inherent in trying to attack nomads. Qing sources record that every time the Qing would launch a punitive expedition against the Kazakhs would get word of it, 2 or 3 days in advance, and then scatter back across the steppe, so they weren't able to attack them. Of course, as I mentioned before, there was a balancing act. The Qing couldn't afford to offend the Kazakhs too much. Another problem that's also apparent from Qing sources is what Qing officials always complained was the lack of centralized authority among the Kazakhs. Right? They would say, well, the Sultan Ablai or Abu al-Faiz, we can tell them this, but then their followers don't necessarily listen to what they say, right? They only have loose control over their people. I won't get into the case of Mingas and Khuturoshi, but one other tried and true tactic that the Qing used to get the Kazakhs to do what they wanted was what's called a diplomatic hostage, where they would kidnap one Kazakh, bring the Kazakh back to the Qing cantonment, either at Tarbagatai and Ili, and then basically blackmail the Kazakhs and extort them and say, if you don't do what we say and pay an indemnity, we're going to keep your Kazakh, we're going to keep this hostage here in Ili until you do what we say. Now, the Qing's solution to the Kazakhs encroaching on Qing territory, let's see if we can find, was to build what's called a karun. Okay, now the karun is a Manchu word meaning a guard outpost. And the Qing built a line of these guard outposts maybe once every 15 to 20 miles and garrisoned them with 15 to 20 troops. And this line of karun outposts marked the furthest extent of Qing control. Right now, the Qing was still claiming to, still had a nominal claim to all of the Jungar lands, but it enclosed all of the lands that it actually controlled within this line of karun outposts. And the karun outposts roughly followed this black line here. Now, from 1760 to 1762, the Ili region, to the south of Lake Jaisang and Tarbagatai, was enclosed within the Karun line. Now, during this time, as I mentioned, Tarbagatai was still an empty frontier claimed by both the Kazakhs and the Qing, but occupied by neither. In 1763, the first garrison was established in Tarbagatai as the Qing tried to lay claim to this region and tried to prevent Kazakh incursions. In 1764, a fortress was established at Yar, west of Tarbagatai. Due to heavy snows and bad weather, the fortress at Yar was moved slightly eastward to the foot of Chukochu Mountain, hence the Uyghur name for this region, Chukchak, today. And in 1767, the Qing finally built a Karun line from Tarbagatai north to Lake Jaisang to try and keep the Kazakhs out. Basically, the Qing was determined to halt the Kazakh advance across the steppe within the Jungar lands, and they were going to halt it along this Karun line and say, here is this is the real limit of our realm. But this line it was a rather arbitrary line. It kind of cut the Kazakh seasonal migration routes. The Qing had a very different conception of territorial sovereignty than did the nomadic Kazakhs, right? The Qing, as an early modern empire, thought it important to draw lines around the territory that it controlled. It had a kind of a bounded sense of territorial sovereignty. The Kazakhs, for their part, as nomads who migrated with the seasons, didn't respect or understand this version of sovereignty. And the Karun line had cut their seasonal migration routes in half. The Qing the Kazakhs migrated into the Lake Jaisang basin in Tarbagatai in the winter because it was at a lower elevation and there was a good winter pasture. Their summer pastures were outside the Karun line. But the Qing insisted on a firm boundary represented by this Karun. Try as they might, and despite punitive expeditions that the Kazakhs, of course, every winter would come to migrate into the Lake Jaisang basin. Now, the Qing's solution to this was the flexible Karun regime. And this was a way of recognizing the reality of Kazakh seasonal migrations, while also allowing the Qing to maintain fictive sovereignty over the territories that it actually controlled. So this was the original Karun line. This is Tarbagatai right here. So it moved north from Tarbagatai around over the Barluk Mountains, around Lake Jaisang, and then followed the shore of the Erchis River here to Honimailahu. The southern extent of Russian control was just up here at Kengurtura, or Ust-Kamenaya in Russian. This is the east-west Karun line that delineated Mongolia from the Qing. The Qing built a second line of Karun along this route here in black. And in the summer, the Qing troops would occupy these Karun outposts, and in the winter, they would occupy these Karun outposts. And essentially, since the Kazakhs were moving back and forth anyway, the Qing just decided to move the border back and forth with the seasons, mirroring the migration patterns of the Kazakhs. So they would move away from these Karun. The Qing troops would abandon these outposts in the summer, allow the Kazakhs to migrate into here, spend the winter, and then and this would be the border, and then in the summer they would expel them and then move the Kowloon line back out here. And in exchange for that, they would charge them a horse rent of 1 horse out of every 100 as a tax. So this allowed the Qing to maintain fictive sovereignty over its own land. So at all times, the Kazakhs were never theoretically within the Qing border. It's just the border moved. You can see it here. This is a map from the Jiaqing period. The purple line is the summer Kowloon, the black is the winter Kowloon. It moved this way with the seasons. You can see Tarbagatai down here. This is Lake Jaisang. This is the Erchis River towards Russia. You can see it here on a bigger map of Xinjiang. This is a Jiaqing era gazetteer. This is kind of a mirror image where the top of the map is south. It's kind of a bird's eye view, but it gives a really clear picture of these of the summer and winter Kowloon line. This is the line running south towards Ili. At Tarbagatai, it splits into 2 spurs. This is the winter Kowloon line. This is the summer Kowloon line, and it's shifted this way to allow the Kazakhs to migrate in here in the winter. Now, that was the first case study. So this is a way of trying to understand the colonization of the Jungar lands within the context of Eurasian history. Instead of seeing the colonization of Xinjiang simply in terms of the migration of Chinese settlers, I've seen it as a 2-part process where the Kazakhs occupied the western parts of the Jungar lands and the Qing occupied the eastern parts of the Jungar lands. And I should also add here that, of course, you might notice that the Russians are nowhere in evidence at this point. You know, it's that the Russians were not the power that determined where the final Qing boundary was. It was the Kazakhs. Of course, in the 19th century, the Russians, beginning the late 18th century and into the 19th century, the Russians would bring the Kazakhs to heel and colonize all of those former territories. But it was originally the Kazakhs and not the Russians who prevented the Qing advance into Central Eurasia. Now, the second case study I'd like to undertake is the important role that Jungar refugees who were captured by the Kazakhs during the Jungar-Kazakh Wars played in facilitating Qing-Kazakh relations. Now, the Kazakhs and Qing sources, so beginning in as I mentioned before, the Qing launched a series of just terrible massacres against the Jungar people from really 1757 to 1759, killing thousands and thousands of Jungars, a process that some scholars have argued is tantamount to ethnic genocide. Of course, not all of the Jungar people were slaughtered during these massacres. Some of them fled to the Russian Empire, some of them fled to Kokand, others hid in the mountain fastness of the Tian Shan. But the bulk of those who survived Qing massacres were taken captive by their longtime historical nemesis, the Kazakhs. As I mentioned in the early part of the presentation, these wars have been going on for almost a century. There were many Oirats living among the Kazakhs, many Kazakh captives living among the Oirats. They oftentimes took on new identities after they were captured. Right? Oftentimes, Kazakhs who were captured by the Jungars would take on the name Mongol, Kazakhs who would take on the name Jungars would take on the name Kazakh. Now, a large number of these Jungar refugees fled to the Kazakhs and submitted to the Qing. After the Qing massacre policy ended in 1759, these Jungar refugees fled en masse from the Kazakh lands and submitted to the Qing Empire and were settled under Qing rule in Ili and Tarbagatai. They hated living under the rule of their enemy, the Kazakhs, so much that they were willing to flee to the Qing, who only 2 years before was massacring their women and children. There was a very large-scale flow of these refugees to the Qing Empire, thousands. And when they would give depositions to Qing officials, they would always say, well, I want to die in the land of the Oirats were Buddhists, and they would say, I want to die in the land of the yellow teaching instead of spending my life in the land of the people without sutras, which is how they referred to the Kazakhs. Now, notably, they never referred to the Kazakhs as Muslims. They simply referred to them as those who don't believe in the sutras. The Qing undertook policies to ensure the loyalty of these new Jungars who submitted to the Qing. They gave them cotton and cloth stipends, grants of livestock herds, reunited relatives who were split apart during the Jungar Wars. Every time an Oirat would submit to the Qing, A series of questions would be asked to them. They would ask them, what is your tribal affiliation? Do you have any? What are the names of all of your relatives? After that, missives would be sent to Urumqi, Ili, and Tarbagatai, and they would check the registers to see if those relatives were there, and if they were, the relatives would be reunited. If not, or even maybe they would allow them to be reunited with a distant cousin. The vast majority of these refugees were men, so there was a huge gender imbalance on the frontier. One of the reasons for this is the Kazakhs a lot of times killed all of the Oirat men because they wanted to keep the women, and they were afraid that the Oirat women would run away if the men were still alive. So we don't see a lot of, and they kept a really tight control of the Oirat women. So we see far more men than women. It's also possible more women died during the violence of the disintegration of the Jungar confederation. So the Qing took a drafted Oirat women or Mongol women from the Chahar lands and paired them up with the new Oirat refugees. At the same time, to ensure the loyalty of Jungars, the Qing abolished Jungar aristocratic titles and rearranged Jungar society around the 8-banner military organization. This is different from its more famous namesake, the Manchu 8 banners. This was more similar to the Chahar 8 banners, which were formed in response to a Chahar uprising in the 17th century. And these rearranged Jungar society along military lines, and it facilitated Qing control of these people. Now, most important for our purposes today is the fact that identities were really slippery in the Kazakh lands. Let's give one example of how quickly identities could change among Oirats. So this is from a man named with the Chinese surname Ma Fu, reported to Qing officials in Mongol. I, Ma Fu, was originally an Oirat of the Kret Ultok. My original name is Boholdai. In the 21st year, 1756, at the place called Jultus, I was taken captive by the emperor's Solon troops and then sold to a Chinese merchant named Ma Ilai in Pijan, where I worked as a merchant. When I was going to transport tribute tea to Ili, Ma Ilai entrusted his 3 camels to me because all of the other merchants' camels were hired out. I loaded the 3 camels up with tea and set off for Ili. After I arrived there, I ran into my older brother, the Oirat soldier Bayan, and we recognized each other. Although Ma Ilai has nurtured me compassionately and I cannot bear to be separated from him, my older brother Bayan has recognized me and constantly entreats me not to leave. I think that it is appropriate for me to remain here, be reunited with my relatives, and become the subject of the emperor and render service just like the other Oirats. So there were thousands of Oirats that had flexible identities. So this is a case of an Oirat under Qing rule. But the same process was going on among Oirats who were living among the Kazakhs, particularly if they had been there longer than one generation. And many Oirats knew not only Oirat, but also Kazakh. The Oirat language, written in the Todo script, became the lingua franca of the Kazakh borderlands. It was a language that the Qing knew, since they'd had over a century of relations with the Jungar people, and of course the Kazakhs knew this language as well, because there were so many Oirats living among them. Now, the Kazakh sultans communicated with the Qing both in Arabic script documents and also this is Todo script, which is a special script to write the Oirat language, but also in Todo script documents. The Qing actually preferred that the Kazakhs not write in their own language, but write in Mongol, because there were really good Qing translators for Mongol documents, but they found it very difficult to translate Arabic script documents. So whenever an Arabic script document came from the Kazakhs, they had to send it, hundreds of miles to Ili, find a local Uyghur there to translate it for them, and then send the translation back to Tarbagatai. Whereas Mongol script documents, they could translate right on the spot, regardless of whether the communications, the missives were in Todo script or in Arabic script. Face-to-face diplomatic negotiations were always carried out in Oirat Mongols using a Mongol translator that invariably accompanied Kazakh diplomatic missions to the frontier. Another importance of Jungar refugees taking advantage of their split identities was in their geographic knowledge. The Jungar refugees were more familiar with the local geography than Qing officials. For example, after a Qing official took a wrong turn and got lost on the road from Urumqi to Kashgar, the Qianlong emperor mandated that an Oirat guide should always accompany soldiers, since the Oirats were more familiar with the local geography. As another example, when the Qing was deciding on where to build the fortress at Tarbagatai, the Qing soldiers built a fortress at Yar on the advice of the Oirats, since they knew what the best pastures were, where the most defensible positions were for building a fortress. Another important role that the Oirat refugees played for the Qing was in making maps. This is one of 4 plates. This is a map of present-day Xinjiang. For those familiar with Chinese geography, this is Bostunur, which is Bositanghu, near the city in Xinjiang of Kuala. This is Harshar, Karashahar. This was a map made when the Torgets, who fled en masse and submitted to the Qing in 1771. Their leader Ubashi was originally pastured in Jair near Tarbagatai. They wanted to move the Torgets, about 40,000 people, south to this region, but they enlisted local Oirats to do a survey of the land. And on this map, these are really kind of yellow post-it notes almost. They were actually yellow pasted onto the map, and these in Manchu talk about how many people could be supported in every summer and every winter pasture. So it lists the summer pastures, the winter pastures, and how many households can be supported in each. The Qing was totally reliant on the Oirats for making these types of maps, since they had lived here for generations, and of course this was their former homeland. They knew very intimately what the quality was of the various pastures. Perhaps the most important role that Oirat refugees played, though, was in providing intelligence to the Qing on the Kazakhs. Now, after the collapse of the Jungar confederation, the Qing was interested in learning the internal political structures of the Kazakhs, a people that they didn't know very well, as well as the disposition of various Kazakh leaders towards the Qing court. So every time an Oirat refugee would submit, they would interrogate them about what they knew about the Kazakhs, about the people that they lived among, what the attitude was of the Kazakhs towards the Qing. They were really curious about Kazakh-Russian relations. They certainly knew that the Kazakhs were playing a double game. They had submitted to the Qing, but they had also submitted to Catherine II, to Russia. So they were trying to understand what the Kazakhs' relationship were with the Russians. At the same time, though, the Qing was also suspicious of Jungar refugees who fled from the Kazakhs and were settled under Qing rule. The Qing was worried that some of these Jungars were secretly working for the Kazakhs, that they would provide the Kazakhs with intelligence on the Qing. To give 2 examples, the first, the case of Umer. In 1760-61, an Oirat named Umer wanted to submit to the Qing, but his elder sister was married to the Kazakh Sultan Ablai. The Qianlong Emperor, in an edict, questioned the loyalty of Umer. He asked why he would be willing to submit to the Qing if his sister was still living with the Kazakh Sultan Ablai in the Kazakh lands. And Qianlong openly entertained the possibility that Umer was spying for the Kazakhs and might tell the Kazakhs inside information on the Qing. He was worried, in short, that Umer was a spy for the Kazakhs. 10 years later, Qianlong was still having these suspicions. An Oirat refugee named Dawa submitted in 1770. He, like Umer, he had also lived in the household of Ablai since he was 10 years old. And Qianlong instructed that he not have any contact with Kazakh merchants and that care be taken that he not run away lest he pass on secret information about the Qing to Ablai. Now, this might seem paranoid this might seem like just paranoia on the part of Qianlong. And of course, we all know that Qianlong was very paranoid at various times. He thought himself to have deep insight into people, but sometimes overthought things. But in this case, I think there was probably something to Qianlong's paranoia. And the reason is because he had his own spy named Burud, who was an Oirat, who was an envoy from the Kazakh lands. He worked in the household of the Kazakh Sultan Abul al-Faiz. And from 1771 until his submission to the Qing in 1775, he provided vital information on the Kazakhs to the Qing, undermining all of their diplomatic bargaining positions with the Qing. He eventually submitted, I have a whole, we won't have time to discuss this in a lot of detail, I have a whole dissertation chapter just on secret agent Burud. He first appears in the historical record in 1771, when the Torgid, who were a group of Oirats who were never part of the Jungar Confederation and lived under Russian rule on the Volga River, fled en masse and submitted to the Qing Empire. Now, the Russians were upset about this, so as were the Kazakhs. So the Kazakhs and the Russians and Kazakhs together put forth a long litany of false rumors about the Torgets, claiming that they wanted to attack the Qing, and they were trying to goad the Qing into attacking the Torgets who were fleeing from Russian territory. Burud accompanied a Kazakh diplomatic mission that was trying to spread these rumors. And of course, one day when no one was listening, he basically undermined the Qing's, the Russian and the Kazakhs' bargaining position by saying like what the Russians and the Kazakhs hoped to what their strategic objectives were in trying to goad the Qing into attacking the Torget. And from that point, for the next 4 years, he served as a spy in the employ of the Qing. He tried to submit several times, and each time a court letter came from the Qing court saying, no, Burud is too important, we can't let him submit yet, unless you've been caught spying by Ablai and Abu al-Faiz and are in trouble. Otherwise, we would prefer you don't submit. 5 years later, he eventually did submit. He also played a role in a separate incident, which is the return of the Dorbit. There was a small number of Oirats on the Volga River who did not flee with the Torget. They live there today. It's part of they're now known as the Kalmuks. They're part of Kalmukia now, under Russian, it's part of Russia actually. But there was a rumor that these Oirats were also going to flee and submit to the Qing, and Burud was instrumental in trying to in undermining these rumors. We're running out of time, so I'll conclude. I have 4 conclusions today. One is the significance of the year 1759. 1759 looks very different when we look at it from the perspective of Eurasian history than it does from the perspective of Qing history. To historians of the Qing, 1759 represents a big break. It represents the end of almost 2,000 years of nomadic raids into China, but it looks different from the perspective of Eurasian history. Because historical dynamics that had existed long before the Qing conquest, that is, historical dynamics between the Qing and the Kazakhs, continued to resonate and be important in the period after 1759. Jungar refugees played a vital role in mediating Qing and Kazakh rule in Central Eurasia, working as translators, guides, map makers, and even as spies. The Qing was already relinquishing control of land outside of the Kaghan line in the 1760s, despite making nominal claims to all of the land of Central Eurasia. They had already relinquished this land to the control of the Kazakhs. And it was the Kazakhs, not the Russians, who prevented the eventual Qing expansion of the Qing realm further into the Jungar lands. Thank you very much for your time. I'm so glad that you came for my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm really looking forward to your comments and critiques. Thank you.